Okay, great. So over to you, Philip.
Yeah, thank you very much, Yadvinda, for the kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone, for those who are joining me here and those who are joining us on the virtual space. Let me take the opportunity to thank you for inviting me to make this presentation. And let me also thank my colleague from the department, Dr. Lawson, who I didn't know was coming, but managed to be here. I'm sure he was somewhere in London. So this afternoon, I'm going to be making a presentation, a talk on climate change and rural livelihoods in northern Ghana. And I'll emphasize why I'm actually focusing on northern Ghana. I'll look at the impacts. I'll look at the impacts, the adaptations, as well as the barriers to these kinds of adaptations. So once again, my name is Philip Antwi-Agyei from the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. So the purpose of this talk is fourfold. The first one is to highlight the effects of climate change on rural livelihoods in Ghana, northern Ghana to be precise. Then the second aspect, we'll look at what are the kinds of adaptation measures that are being used by farming households to address climate change on their livelihoods. And then the third aspect will look into the barriers that confront farmers in the attempt to address climate change effects. And finally, I'll try and make some suggestions in terms of how to build resilience in rural livelihoods in farming systems. The IPCC, that is the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change report, over the years, have consistently described Africa as the most vulnerable continent. And this has been attributed to a number of things, including low adaptive capacity, low infrastructure development, and economies highly dependent on rainfall agricultural systems. There was a recent report by the World Meteorological Organization, the WMO, that was released, I think, last year or so. And that report suggests that Africa suffers disproportionately from climate change effects. There were a number of key messages that they put up, but I want to focus on three for the purpose of this presentation. They said that one, temperature increases is accelerating in Africa. Two, extreme weather events is worsening food security or food insecurity, displacement and conflicts, and also agricultural productivity is falling all over the continent. Agriculture is highly vulnerable to climate change effects. And this is, as I've already said, because most of the economies in Africa depends on entirely what we call rain-fed agricultural system, whereby farmers depend on how much rains come to be able to plan their farming practices. The agricultural sector is so important, contributing significantly to GDP in Africa, and supports or employs around 55% of the labor force, but yet its growth in terms of productivity has declined over the years by 34% since 1961 due to climate change, as reported by the World WMO in 2003. One of the countries that is most affected by climate change is Ghana. A recent report, I think this was released just last month or so, suggests that Ghana could be described as a climate hotspot. And a number of factors could be attributed to this. Again, low adaptive capacity, and then economy highly reliant on rain-fed agricultural system. But what happens is that Ghana is also projected to suffer increased temperatures and erratic rainfall patterns, and this threaten the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly goals relating to Goal 1, Goal 2, and Goal number 13. It also threatens the attainment of the mitigation and adaptation actions that have been outlined and in our nationally determined contribution that was submitted under the Paris Climate Agreement. I want to focus on northern Ghana for a number of reasons. This was a paper that I wrote from the first paper I wrote from my PhD in 2012. And this evening, I'll be focusing on personal experiences in terms of the effects, adaptations, and barriers to climate change adaptations in Ghana. I mean, this paper, we published it in Applied Geography in 2012, and we mapped the vulnerability of crop production to drought in Ghana using rainfall, yield, and temperature and socioeconomic data. What we found out was that as you move towards the northern part of the country geographically, vulnerability of food system or food production system experiences a very high vulnerability. And there was also some kind of socioeconomic dimension to this, because these are regions where there's low infrastructure development and also very low adaptive capacity in terms of how they address climate change effects. So the three northern regions, based on the previous demarcation of the country, were found to be the most vulnerable to the adverse impacts of climate change: the upper east, upper west, and then northern region proper. Let me provide some definitions, because I'll be using these terms throughout these discussions, and I want us to be clear what I mean by these terms. So what I mean by livelihood is that livelihood comprises the capabilities, assets, and this includes the stores, resources, claims, and assets, and activities required for a means of a living. This is a very popular definition, which was provided by Chambers and Cornwell in 1992. Adaptation is any practice that help the stakeholders to reduce the adverse effects of climate change on their livelihoods. And then what I mean by more adaptation is that more adaptation refers to actions or inactions that may lead to increased risk of adverse climate change related outcomes, increased vulnerability to climate change now or in the future. Maybe I'll explain this again in the course of the discussions. Then what I mean by barriers are factors, conditions, or obstacles that reduce the effectiveness of adaptation practices implemented by households or other stakeholders. In terms of climate change, we've realized that climate change is indeed affecting agro livelihoods in northern Ghana, to be precise. This was a study that we did to understand how climate variability is affecting selected stable crops in northern Ghana. We focus on groundnut, sorghum, millet, maize, and rice. And we could, we've concluded that about 43%, 32, 30, 25, and 14% of the variations in the yields of groundnut, millet, sorghum, maize, and rice could be attributed to changes in the onset, number of dry days, annual rainfall, and cessation. And this is quite significant. If you are having 43% of variations in the yield of groundnut that is attributed to some of these things, then we need to be careful and address the effects of climate change on livelihood. Then we did another study to look at not only these staple crops, but look at leguminous crops and see how the onset of the rainfall, cessation, and the length of the rainy season affects the yields of these leguminous crops, mainly groundnut, cowpea, and soybeans. These are things that we fall on, especially in northern region, as a means of ensuring food security. And we realized that the yields of not only staples, but also leguminous crops were significantly influenced by the number of raining days, the length of the raining days, the onset of the rainy season, as well as the cessation. And this all affects how much yield farmers were getting for their groundnut, cowpea, and soybeans. Northern Ghana, I describe Northern Ghana as having what you call double exposure. I mean, this is very popular in the climate change literature, in the sense that they experience a lot of dry spell for most parts of the season, from somewhere late October until late May, they experience dry spell. And then when the rains have finally come for them to plant their crops and other things, they begin to experience floods that destroy the crop that they've waited to plant. So I've always said that Northern Ghana experiences double exposure, and that makes them more vulnerable than the rest of the country. Climate change also perpetuates existing vulnerability, and it has got some kind of socioeconomic dimension to it The IPCC reports and a lot of literature in climate change suggests that the most vulnerable in dryland farming systems are women, children, and then the elderly. These are people who have less access to land, especially when it comes to women, and have less access to productive and economic resources that could make them address the adverse impacts of climate change. So when we are looking at climate change effects on the northern Ghana, we need to look at the socioeconomic conditions surrounding different groups within the region. Therefore, if farmers were going to be able to address the adverse effects of climate change, we need to be able to take adaptation very seriously. So I said adaptation is quite critical. The United Nations Convention, Framework Convention on Climate Change, that's UNFCCC, suggests that there are two main ways of addressing climate change, and these are what we call mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is any practice that will help you to increase carbon sinks so that you reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that are produced and slow down global warming eventually. But for the purpose of this talk, I'm not going to be focusing on mitigation. I'm focusing on adaptation. And we are saying that adaptation is critical if smallholder farmers in rain-fed agricultural systems were to be able to reduce their overall vulnerability to the adverse impacts of climate change. Now, the second part of my talk, I want to walk us through some of the key adaptation practices in northern Ghana. Most of these may be found in southern Ghana, but I'm focusing specifically on northern Ghana because of the fact that I've done most of my work and I'm drawing mostly from my experiences or research experiences for this presentation. But before I go into what farmers do, we need to place this within the context of what is happening in the country. So addressing climate change is a top priority for the government of Ghana or Ghana as a country. And a number of policy initiatives have been developed to address climate change. The first one was in 2012, we developed what we call our National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy, which was followed by the National Climate Change Policy, which has been described as one of the best for the sub-region. Then in 2015, we did a master plan for national climate change. And then in 2015, again, we submitted our nationally determined contributions under the Paris Climate Agreement. Then with 2016, we developed the National Adaptation Plan Framework, as well as the National Gender Policy that could help us to address gender dimension of climate change. Then 2021, as required of parties under the Conference of Parties, Ghana submitted the revised nationally determined contribution detailing its commitment in terms of mitigation and adaptation practices that could help us to address climate change and slow down global warming. Then at the moment, we are part of people who are leading the EPA to develop what we call the National Adaptation Plan. What it seeks to do is to look at how do we plan our adaptation from a bottom-up approach instead of always doing the top-down approach. So I'm now going to walk us through some of the key practices. So when it comes to adaptation in northern Ghana, a lot of the farmers are practicing what we call crop rotation. What they do is to take advantage of soil fertility issues such that they grow maize and intersperse this or grow other leguminous crop in the next year to take advantage of soil fertility that may be in the system. A lot of them are also planting drought-tolerant crops, cassava, which did not used to be a major crop in northern Ghana, and now a lot of farmers are growing because cassava is at least a bit more tolerant when it comes to drought in that sense. Then a lot are also growing early maturing varieties of crops. The essence of this is that farmers are able to grow so that by the time the crop gets to most of the important stages, such as tasseling for maize, and when they are experiencing dry spell, they would have escaped some of the critical stages in their development. And then I need to highlight that a lot of the farmers are also going into or diversifying their livelihoods. A lot are going into what we call hat weaving and basket weaving and the rest. But I've also found one adaptation strategy that I need to mention, that is charcoal production. a lot of women are producing charcoal, and I'll get back to this and see what are the effects of this on the long-term adaptive capacity of farming households within the region. A lot are also migrating temporarily to start in Ghana to seek some kind of employment to do in the course of the dry spell. As I mentioned earlier, this is a region where farming is the most predominant source of livelihoods. Yet between October or early November till late May, they are not able to do any proper farming without some kind of irrigation facility. So most of them, or some of them, migrate, especially the able-bodied young men and women, migrate in search of jobs in southern Ghana to support home and then go back when things are okay. Then the selling of livestock is also a big issue, a big adaptation strategy or coping mechanism that farmers are using. But the point is that we've done work that suggests that, and this is also in the literature, that if farmers were able to get access to small irrigation facilities, they will be able to reduce their overall exposure and vulnerability to climate change. What happens is that during that period, when there are no rains, then they can go into small-scale garden to produce vegetables to sell and then buy food in that sense. We've also done work, and as I said, I'm drawing a lot on my research experience. We've also done work where we found out that a lot of farmers are using indigenous or traditional agroecological knowledge to adapt to climate change and variability in the Upper East region of Ghana. I mean, this was work done by one of my PhD students in 2021, Dr. Frank Bafo Atta. What we found out was that a lot of them were using the appearance of certain species of bird, the flowering of certain plant species, and then even the cry of the way the sun shines in the course of the day. So they use the indigenous knowledge that has been passed on to them over the years by their grandfathers to determine when there's going to be a dry spell or when the rains are about to come. But I need to mention something here, that the ability of the smallholder farmer to use his indigenous knowledge to address climate change is being compromised because of the projected increases in in temperature and rainfall variability. The use of climate-smart agricultural intervention has been promoted recently by development agencies, FAO, and the rest. And when you talk of climate-smart agricultural intervention, it's any intervention that does three things. One, increase productivity. Two, address mitigation issues or reduce emissions. And three, build the capacity of farmers to address climate change effects. So what we did was that we looked at the typologies and the drivers of the adoption of CSA or climate-smart agricultural interventions by smallholder farmers in rural northern Ghana. We found out that farmers were using what we call conservation agriculture, soil and water conservation, agroforestry practices to a large extent, use of climate information, and then no burning of residues as some of the climate-smart agricultural interventions. We wanted to find out what actually influenced the adoption of some of these practices in northern Ghana. And we realized that through this work where we used the theory of plant behavior and structural equation model to understand the adoption behavior of farmers with regards to climate-smart agricultural intervention. Our studies suggest that farmers' attitude as well as social pressure or subjective norms could influence or have significant impact on their intention to adopt CSA practices within this particular region. But the question I want to ask this afternoon is, are farmers coping or adapting? Coping mechanisms are different from adaptations. Coping mechanisms are usually short-term temporal measures that are taken to reduce the adverse impacts of climate change compared to long-term adaptation that will help farmers to build their capacity and address climate change effects. I've done work that suggests that many of the adaptation practices being employed by farmers are making them more vulnerable in the course of time. And this is where the term I explained as maladaptation comes in. That is when you put in adaptation practice that end up making you worse off or making somebody or another system worse off. And a number of adaptation strategies that I've found over the years, including selling of livestock as a coping mechanism, irrigation. If you are developing small scale irrigation facilities, it will help farmers to address their food challenges. But what it means is that you are also creating conducive environments for the breeding of malaria mosquitoes and others that could have significant effects on the health of the farmers. So maladaptation or adaptive outcomes is something that we need to look at when we are designing climate change adaptation practices. Now, what are the barriers that confront farmers? We did this work, I led this work in 2014, and we identify a number of adaptation barriers through a field work in Northeast Ghana and then systematic literature review. The barriers could be classified or categorized into 4 key categories, and these were financial barriers, sociocultural barriers, technological barriers, and institutional barriers. And I'll talk through many of these as I go through the presentation. One of the things that we also found out was that we realized that land tenure was a big issue and could serve as a potential barrier for adaptation, particularly in northern Ghana. And this is especially so for women and migrant farmers who have limited access to land and productive resources that are able, that make them able to address climate change effect. I mean, the point of the paper was that if tenure is not secure, land tenure is not secure, it deters farmers, it deters people from making investment, heavy investment into soil and land management practices. Therefore, we need to look at statutory versus customary land tenure. But I need to mention here that the context is highly significant, highly crucial. What happens in Southern Ghana may be different from what happens in Northern Ghana. Therefore, policymakers need to look at the socioeconomic conditions before coming out with some of these policies. So we wanted to also find out what motivate farmers to use climate-smart agricultural interventions and the barriers associated with this. And we realized that even though climate-smart agricultural technologies are being promoted for the ability to reduce greenhouse gases, there was a mismatch between the expectations of promoters of CSA practices and the farmers on the ground. The farmer is not interested too much on how much reduction is made as regards to greenhouse gases by a particular practice. What a farmer is interested in is how much is able to produce or how much yield he gets from his crop to feed himself and his family. So we realized that in terms of the 3 triple wins or the 3 pillars, the motivation for the implementation or adoption of CSA practices in Northern Ghana is influenced greatly by food security matters or productivity and not necessarily their ability to reduce greenhouse gases. One of the key limitations that we found out is the limitations in quality and uptake of weather services. If farmers are able to get climate information, the literature suggests that they'll be able to plan what they do in terms of when to plant, when to harvest, and when to even do spraying and other disease management control. We've done work where we use Ghana as a case study to understand climate services for enhancing resilient agricultural system in Anglophone West Africa. And the point of the fact was that most of these countries within Anglophone West Africa acknowledge climate change as a huge issue, but when it comes to climate services, there's a huge gap in terms of filling or in terms of providing climate services for farmers and other households to address their climate change needs or adaptation needs. Then policy context for climate change adaptation. We've done some work that explains or throw light on the fact that there are significant challenges with institutional capacity, a lack of coordination among national agencies, as well as insignificant or insufficient resources with regards to logistics in moving forward climate change adaptations in northern Ghana and I think I'll get back to this at some point in the presentation. So having known the key adaptations options as well as the major barriers that confront farming households and then the effects of climate change on livelihoods, I want to now look at how can we build resilience in our food system, especially in dryland farming system. And many of the suggestions that I will make, again, are based on my experiences from field work, and it's not going to be helpful for only Ghana, but most dryland farming system across West Africa. Sustainable funding mechanism is crucial for adaptation. As I mentioned earlier in one of my slides, we found out that the 4 categories of barriers were financial, institutional, technological, and sociocultural. Ghana's revised national determined contribution as submitted in 2001 mention or highlight 19 policy actions in 10 priority areas. And this is to achieve our nationally determined contribution goals. The 19 policy actions translate into 13 adaptation and 34 mitigation programs of action. But the point here is that many of these adaptation and mitigation actions are contingent on our ability to receive funding from external sources. Ghana requires between 9.3 US billion and then 15.5 for mitigation of investment to be able to implement the 47 nationally determined contribution as we have outlined in our national determined contribution between 2020 and 2030. The point here is that if we are not able to source external funding, then our ability to, even though we've detailed a number of very impressive adaptation and mitigation actions, our ability to implement these kinds of programs of actions will be hugely impaired because of lack of funding. Therefore, I want to suggest that sustainable funding mechanism is so crucial for adaptation actions across dryland farming system in Africa. Community-based participatory flood risk management. I think I've mentioned dry spell or drought and flood. And one of the things that we are doing to help farmers through the NAP or the National Adaptation Plan that we are developing, as I mentioned, this is bottom-up approach. So we are capacitating communities to identify their own vulnerabilities when it comes to flood. So what we do is communities are therefore able to identify which aspects of their communities where within the communities are vulnerable. And we've done this across the country through workshop, focus group discussions, and other participatory methods, and it's yielding positive results. What happens is if you engage farmers, if you engage rural livelihoods, if you engage stakeholders in identifying their own vulnerabilities in terms of flood and drought, it helps them to own whatever strategy you develop, and then they are able to implement it because you haven't sat somewhere to design this thing for them. Most often than not, what happens is that as scientists, we sit at the comfort of our offices and design things for the community, not knowing how they will even implement some of these things. So I'm advocating and strongly encouraging the fact that we need to go out into the community, help them to identify where and when they experience flood, dry spell, and the rest, so that we'll be able to design community-led interventions to address many of the challenges associated with climate change, especially floods and dry spells. We also need to avoid unintended consequences of climate change adaptations. I've mentioned here time and again in terms of more adaptations. We wanted to find out what were the unintended consequences, or what we call trade-offs, from that adoption of CSA or climate smart agricultural interventions. And we realized that there are a number of trade-offs that are associated with climate change, climate smart agricultural interventions. Therefore, when we are designing climate smart agricultural intervention policy, we need to take into consideration the trade-offs. What I mean by trade-off is that when you implement a strategy that will work, but at the end of the day, it delivers some kind of consequence in other sectors. And I think I used the case of small-scale irrigation as an example. For this paper, we employed what we call the analytic hierarchy process to identify the trade-offs that are associated with climate smart agricultural interventions. One of the things that we also need to take very serious is access to improved weather and climate services. This was a barrier that I mentioned. So if farmers can get access to climate information, they'll be able to plan when to plant, when to apply fertilizers, and when to even harvest. It's so disturbing that these are poor farmers who may struggle to get money to buy pesticides and fertilizers, and if they are not able to get information when the rains will come or the wind will come, they can apply fertilizer, and within the shortest possible time, this will be washed away. So if farmers will be provided with improved weather, accurate and timely climate information, it will build their resilience in addressing the effects of climate change on their livelihoods. Again, what the season might look like, and I was having discussions with Dr. Neil Hart this morning in terms of what farmers look for and not we want to provide for them. So farmers are not interested too much on how much rains will come in the course of the year. There's no point telling a farmer in Northern Ghana, we are going to be experiencing 1,005 mm, 1,800 mm of rainfall in the course of the year. It doesn't make any sense to them. What makes sense to them is the information on the characteristics of the rains during the farming season. What is the information on the onset of the rain, the distribution of the rains in the course of the farming season is so crucial, because that determines soil moisture availability. What are the dry spells? I have heard farmers telling me they planted with the first rains and the rain stopped. So by the time the next rain came, most of the crops almost died off. So we need to have a discussion on weather versus seasonal forecast. Farmers are interested in weather forecast, what is happening in the next week or in the next month. Then, as much as possible, if we can, let's try and co-produce climate information with farmers. Sometimes we think that our knowledge is superior to them, but let me mention here that these people have addressed climate change effects for over a long period of time, and they know how to go about it. So can we co-produce climate information with farmers? If we're able to do that, then, as I said earlier, this becomes a bottom-up approach. They will own it, and therefore they will be able to believe in the application of this information than we sitting somewhere and producing it to them. We have also found out that the availability of agricultural extension, this was a paper that was published, I think 2021 thereabout. And we found out that if farmers could get access to enough extension services in terms of when the rains are coming, in terms of how the season will look like, through collaboration with the National Met Services or Met Office, it will help them to be able to plan their adaptation practices and coping mechanisms in the course of the year. Nature-based solutions to climate change risk is also crucial. Nature-based approach delivers multiple socioeconomic and cultural co-benefits to local communities, and this has been repeated in the literature. If you read the literature on climate change and nature-based solutions, there are a number of socioeconomic and cultural benefits that one could derive from the adoption of nature-based solutions. And more importantly, nature-based solutions align with our national adaptation planning as well as the national biodiversity strategy and Action Plan, which was developed in 2002. Not only that, but we need to be able to develop or improve soil health and whether organic matter enhancements. And I had a fellowship recently where we tried through the Royal Society to look at how we can build, assess organic matter content and build organic matter or enhance organic matter and promote soil health to address climate change effects. I mean, what happens beneath the ground is as crucial as what happens above ground. So we assess soil health across a number of regions in northern Ghana, and even we did some at the transitional zone within Ghana. And we've published a number of 1 or 2 papers on this, where the argument is that if farmers can have a very good organic matter enhancement practices, or if the soil is very good, we can improve soil health, then it will help farmers to address the adverse effects of climate change on their livelihoods. So in conclusion, I want to state 3 key conclusions from this presentation today: that climate change poses or presents significant challenge to socioeconomic and livelihood opportunities in rural northern Ghana. And this is something that we need to address, because these are communities predominantly dependent on rain-fed agricultural system as their source of livelihoods. Again, rural livelihoods need to be supported to be able to address the challenges that confront them. And by doing that, we will build their resilience in the face of climate change effects. And I've mentioned nature-based solutions, improve soil health, and timely access to early warning systems and climate information as being critical for food risk, flood risk, and dry spell risk management in dryland farming systems. The key take-home message this afternoon or this evening are 4. And if you forget about everything, I don't want you to forget this take-home messages. 1, we need sustainable financing of climate adaptations in Ghana to address climate change effects or climate change risk. I've highlighted through a number of slides or through this presentation that adaptation is critical, but farmers are also confronted with a number of barriers, and one of them is the issue of financial barriers. And so if we can provide sustainable financing through access to credit, unfortunately, farming is so the risk in farming is so high, especially in dryland farming system, where everything depends on the availability of the natural rains. It therefore means that farmers are not able to access credit like other sectors will do. So they need to be supported, and they need to have access to appropriate credit so that they can plan their adaptation practices. Then participatory design of climate change adaptations is also vital for scaling up effective adaptations. If farmers are involved or stakeholders are involved in the design of adaptations, they, as I said earlier, they own it. They see it as a very locally designed kind of solutions to their drought or dry spell and flood challenges. Land tenure security is also critical. If climate adaptation are to be successful, we need to strengthen land tenure issues. And the issue here is, do we go for customary rights or arrangement or statutory arrangement? And I've mentioned earlier today and the previous presentation that I've had since I came that context is so important. There's no need for one-fit-all land tenure system or climate change policy to address climate change effects. And finally, institutional capacity building and coordination among various national agencies need to be strengthened. And once we do that, we'll be able to address climate change effects. What we found out is that sometimes there are duplications of efforts across different ministries. So if we can avoid that and coordinate better in terms of allocating our scarce resources, we'll be able to address climate change effects and improve the resilience of the most vulnerable amongst our people in northern Ghana and Ghana in general. I want to acknowledge my university, the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, the Commonwealth Scholarship, and then African Academy of Sciences, Nairobi, the Royal Society, landing here, and more importantly, farmers in my study communities who have been so helpful in Ghana, and then my research collaborators, Professor Andy Dugo and Professor Lindsay Stringer of the University of York. And thank you for coming.
Some questions? That's just for me. You've got a mic, so just online.
Yeah.
But I'll just kick off. You mentioned that Ghana said is particularly vulnerable to climate change, and given that you've worked on climate change in Africa, why is that? What makes Ghana more vulnerable than many countries in Africa to climate change effects?
How do we do this? Do I answer every question? Okay.
Answer me, and then we'll pass it on.
Okay, so I think there are a number of factors. Our adaptive capacity is very low. And then we depend on rain-fed agricultural system. Agriculture contributes to about 19% of the GDP. Of course, I mean, it depends on the source, but it used to be more than that. The contribution to GDP keeps increasing because of climate change and other non-climate factors. Many of the farmers are also small scale. About 80% of our farmers are small scale farmers who cultivate less than two hectares of land. And therefore, any slight changes in the rainfall patterns make Ghana so vulnerable. In addition to that, I mean, when it comes to policy-wise, I think we are better off than most of the countries around West Africa. But then implementation is a big issue. Implementation is a big issue. Do we effectively implement what we put down? I think I highlighted a number of very important framework and policies and strategy, but sometimes it's the implementation which becomes a challenge. And then, I mean, how much do we invest when it comes to weather services? I think, I mean, GMET is now doing well. They are doing so well in terms of forecasting compared to in the past 10 or 20 years back. But there's still a lot that could be done to capacitate them. I'm not trying to compare Ghana to Senegal, but I've been to Senegal through African Swift, and they do so much well in terms of their climate services. So the point is that we can do well, but some of these factors, the fact that we have low adaptive capacity, the fact that we don't implement most of our policies, and then we have a lot of our farmers, smallholder farmers, depending on rain-fed agricultural system, makes our economy very vulnerable to climate change effects. Thank you.
Thank you. We will open up for the floor. All right.
Thanks. Is this on?
Yeah, it's on.
Okay. Thanks, Philip, for a great talk. I wanted to ask a bit more about what you just mentioned about the implementation of the policies. And you had that nice slide saying, since 2012, Ghana's had various national plans for action on climate change. And I wanted to know, in your experience of working in Northern Ghana, sort of say since 2012, what you've actually seen changing on the ground for smallholder farmers as a result of these different action plans and policies that the Ghanaian government has put forward.
Thank you very much, Laura. Yeah, I knew Laura was going to ask me a question because I examined her yesterday in a PhD. And Wednesday, I made a presentation and she was not allowed to ask me a question.
I have more questions.
But at least today we've done the Bible, so she's allowed to ask questions. I mean, a lot has happened. If you take Northern Ghana, many of the NGOs, many of the development programs are focused or concentrated in Northern Ghana because of their peculiar vulnerability. The trouble is that the farming season in Northern Ghana keep shortening. I have spoken to farmers who are 70, 80-year-old who in Bongo, that is very northeast, close to Burkina Faso, telling me that when they were 15, 20 years, they could plant their crops in February. Now they have to wait until late May. Even late May is not happening. They have to wait until early June. The point here is that I'm sure there are a lot of interventions through some of these policies. I have seen a lot of government interventions through the various governments, the past government and the present government, trying to build resilience in Northern Ghana. They are now planting, I think there was one program that they are planting a number of trees. Also a number of initiatives, one village, one dam, which is mostly done in Northern Ghana. There are challenges with this, but I need to stress that at least it's getting better, but the point is that rainfall is getting more erratic and temperature is also increasing. So it doesn't matter how much you try, you are almost against the wall, and it's something that we need to push further. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, thanks for the really interesting talk. So you tweaked something there that I've been thinking about for a little while. I have a student who's doing her studies on resilience, and so I'm kind of from the sustainability jargon generation, and now that we have all this resilience stuff, so we spent weeks looking for like the right definition of resilience. And she's getting funded by the United Nations, and so they gave her a couple of definitions, and I was like, in my mind, that's survival, that's not resilience. And when you said that's coping, that's not resilient, it really resonated with me. How do you talk about that in an academic setting? How do you talk about like this resilience is not survival, resilience is not just coping and actually like living or still having something to eat tomorrow? In your academic work, because I find that really interesting as a concept.
Thank you very much. I mean, resilience as a concept was borrowed from the evolutionary biology. If you read the early literature, that was where it was borrowed in the sustainability and then climate change. So resilience simply means ability to bounce back after you face some kind of perturbation. So if a farmer is resilient, if a farming system is resilient, it means that when that farming system experiences climate shocks or climate anomaly, dry spell or flood, climate-induced floods or dry spell, that system doesn't suffer enough, that doesn't suffer significant yield losses. So some practitioners will flip it and say that resilience is the opposite side of vulnerability, but it's not the case. Somebody may not be vulnerable, but not necessarily resilient. So when there is a flood, when there is drought, and a farming system or a particular group is able to bounce back and do whatever they were doing, have food, have whatever they were having, then in a way they are resilient. Or when drought does not precipitate significant loss in yield. There was a paper which was written by Ivan Fraser using the Irish farming of the 18th century. And it was quite interesting, and he was comparing sensitivity to resilience. So for me, coping is not resilience. Coping is trying to survive. And a typical example is you are a farmer, you have your crops being washed away by flood.
But is a farmer that migrates, for example, resilient? Because
No.
the Irish did.
No. If you migrate, what I've seen in Northern Ghana, migration is not resilience. Migration is coping. They move to make sure at least there's enough, they get something to do, get enough money to buy food back and go back. So it's not resilience. Resilience will involve proper planning, assuming we're going to experience drought and we begin to develop drought-resistant varieties of crops. Now, all the ensemble models of IPCC suggest that we are likely to experience high temperatures over the years for almost all the regions, particularly West Africa. If we were able to plan and develop drought-tolerant varieties of crops, that farmers will be able to plant, and in spite of these droughts or in spite of these high temperatures, they're able to maintain the yield that they will be having or even more. Then we are building their resilience. But it's not when I always say there's flood and then government agencies come, distribute tents and put people temporarily somewhere. That is coping, and that is making sure they survive the immediate effects of climate change and not the long-term impasse. I hope I've been able to explain this to you. Yes.
That was great. Thank you very much. I was just wondering, you said that you saw that they were using different methods for improving soil health. I wondered what those methods were, if they were using them already in northern Ghana.
Yeah, farmers, I mean, the idea of that work was to look at what we call climate smart agricultural interventions. And I think I defined this in my presentation as any practice that would deliver three things, or what we call the triple wins: productivity, mitigation, and adaptive capacity. Now, many of these things are things farmers are already doing. So like mulching, farmers do mulch to improve soil structure, improve retention of soil moisture. And by doing that, we found out that soil health is so crucial. Sometimes we tend to focus too much on what happens above ground and at the neglect of the below ground characteristics. So if we can do that, if we can improve aeration within the soil such that soil microorganisms can have enough distance to do that, then you are building the health of the soil. So there are a number of small practices that they are doing that helps them to address that. I think I was talking to somebody who was doing a work trying to measure how the microclimate within a particular area could be modified by some kind of interventions in a forest or something of that sort. So farmers do a number of things, but these are things that they've been doing in the past. Growing cover crops. If you grow cover crops, for instance, will help you to build that kind of soil health. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. So my question goes very much along what you presented there, this 9 to 15 billion of investment needed for adaptation. And so for me, the question is, who calculates these numbers? How are they calculated? Did they convince your own Minister of Finance? And how much did he really put down? And then actually ends up in a village. And then also, how much is the Green Climate Fund? Because half of it should be dedicated to adaptation. How much is actually then coming from these international sources to cover these enormous amounts of money?
Yeah, thank you very much. Maybe I should have broken the figures down into what will come locally. So when you take any nationally determined contribution by any country, there are what we call, especially for most part from Africa, there are what we call conditional programs of actions or conditional actions, and then unconditional actions. The unconditional actions are those that the country will be able to implement irrespective of external support. And the figure that I put there is what will be the total for what we need, what we can generate, and what will come from outside. So, and these are calculated. I was part of the people who did this, revised this the national determined contribution. I focus on the adaptation side, and then one other consultant did the mitigation side. But we calculate this. We have programs of action. I think I mentioned about 30 programs of action for mitigation, and then 17 or so for adaptation. We calculate how much it will cost to implement each of these, and then put it together to get the lump sum. So Ghana as a country is not saying that we are going to fold our arms and then wait for international support. We are putting in, maybe I should have, as I said, breaking this down. We are bringing in some, but to be able to implement all the 47 programs of actions, we need external support. And this can be sourced through the Green Climate Fund and other such mechanisms under the climate change, UNFCCC and others. Thank you very much.
Can I have a follow-up? So how is money spent then? So let's say that there's a program identified. Is this then just central government sends money to these programs and the programs are implemented? Or are you also having, let's say, public-private partnerships where banks cover some of the risk and then some other risk is covered by some of this money?
I'm not too sure how that is done, but maybe I'll put, and this is my personal reflection on this. It's not, I don't work at the Ministry of Finance or Ministry of Environment. So this is my personal, let me put that caveat. So what happens is that I know there are a number of banks, especially EcoBank, which is into a lot of adaptation financing, trying to build resilience and that kind of thing. So when we get, I'm sure when you get climate finance, normally these are program-based. So you write a program like the National Adaptation Plan that we are doing is program-based. And most of the time, I have even done work for ministries where payment has been done from outside the country. I did a work for EPA, designing the National Adaptation Framework, but most of my payments came from IISD in Canada. So it's not, I don't think it's every time that money is paid to central government for that, but it depends on the amount. If it is a huge amount that's for a huge program, I think it's paid to central government, and then they can then implement that based on what was proposed in the program that was submitted, or the proposal that was submitted. I wish I had a better answer, but unfortunately, I don't work in the Ministry of Finance, and I don't want to say things to commit anybody.
Thanks, Philip. So I've been browsing through climate maps because that's the kind of man I am, and I've been looking at, it seems that the past to present rainfall change is probably greater than the present to future rainfall change, which means that the threat to drought is from the continuous temperature change. So I'm just wondering about what the most effective adaptation actions would actually be. Obviously, storing water and using it well, as you were pointing out, would be good. But would tree planting help? If you've got the same amount of water and the temperature goes up and the evaporation goes up, yes, you would shade the ground more, but would the trees take out more of the available water? I don't know if you have any thoughts on this.
I mean, it's difficult to stand here and say that this particular adaptation will solve all our troubles. I don't think anyone, even if you build a huge dam, I don't think it will solve all adaptation troubles. And of course, when you are damming, we know the implications of that. You are displacing people from their land. You are depriving people downstream not to get access to the same water source, a number of things. The point is that we need to examine these kinds of adaptations, a number of them using irrigation, drought tolerant crops, early maturing varieties of crops, climate smart agricultural interventions. We need to combine them. There are adaptations that may work for one group and may not work for another group. That was why I'm mentioning in my take-home message or the conclusion that we don't have to encourage one-fit-all policy where we design one-fit-all adaptation policy that everybody should do irrigation farming. There are people who may not want to even do dry season garden, but they may want to rather temporarily migrate to other places to survive. How do we support them? So we can only do that when we talk to farmers, when we talk to the stakeholders. They know what will work for them and how that will work out for them. So once we do that, then we'll be able to address some of the challenge to a large extent. But there's no one straight answer. We need to, or one straight measure. We need to have a combination of different practices that will then yield significant kind of effect in terms of addressing climate change. Thank you.
Okay, great. Any more questions? If not, we have drinks at the back and snacks, so do feel free to linger for a further conversation. But thank you very much. Thank you.
And thank you very much for having me.